In 1947, a cure for syphilis existed. It was cheap, widely available, and it worked. It was called penicillin. The United States government knew this, and for the next 25 years, they deliberately withheld it from 399 black men in rural Alabama, men who had been told they were receiving treatment, men who trusted the doctors in white coats, men who had no idea they were being watched die on purpose. This was not a secret experiment run by a rogue scientist. It was funded by the U.S. Public Health Service. It ran for 40 years. And when it was finally exposed, the government's response was not to apologize. It was to ask why anyone found out. This is the story of the Tuskegee Syphilis study, and it is one of the most important things you will ever learn about the relationship between medicine, race, and power in America. Macon County, Alabama, 1932. The Great Depression was crushing the country. For black sharecroppers in the rural South, it was devastating in a way that is hard to overstate. Most had never seen a doctor. Medical care was a luxury that didn't reach them. Illiteracy was widespread, and trust in institutions, especially white institutions, was complicated by a history of exploitation that stretched back centuries. Syphilis was rampant in the region. The U.S. Public Health Service had already run programs to treat it. But in 1932, funding dried up, and rather than simply closing the program, a researcher named Dr. Taliaferro Clark proposed something different. He wanted to study what untreated syphilis looked like, specifically in black men. The racist medical assumption of the era held that syphilis affected black and white patients differently. This claim had no scientific basis, but it had institutional credibility. And that was enough. 600 black men were recruited. 399 already had latent syphilis. 201 did not and would serve as a control group. The men were told they had bad blood, a vague local term that covered everything from fatigue to anemia to syphilis. They were not told the truth about their diagnosis. In exchange for participating, they received something extraordinary for men in their position: free medical care, free meals on examination days, free transportation, and crucially, a burial insurance policy. For men who couldn't afford a funeral, that was not a small thing. The study was supposed to last 6 months. 6 months became 40 years. The researchers kept watching. They kept collecting data. And as the years passed, something happened that transformed this study from an ethically questionable piece of research into something far worse. Penicillin arrived. By 1947, penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis. It was effective. It was available. The study participants could have been treated and cured. Instead, the USPHS made a deliberate decision. The men would not be told. They would not be treated. The study would continue. To make sure of this, local physicians in Macon County were quietly asked not to treat the study participants if they came in. During World War II, when many of the men were called up for the draft and would have received mandatory syphilis treatment through the military, the USPHS intervened to have them exempted from treatment. The U.S. government actively blocked its own citizens from receiving a known cure for a lethal disease. Not because of ignorance, but because the data was more valuable to them than the lives. What the men received instead was theater. Spinal taps, a painful and risky procedure, were described to participants as special free treatment. Blood draws were framed as part of their ongoing care. The coffin insurance was renewed each year, a quiet acknowledgement of the only outcome the researchers were truly waiting for. In 1965, a young epidemiologist named Peter Buxton was hired by the USPHS in San Francisco. He heard about the Tuskegee study from colleagues, almost in passing. He couldn't believe it was real. In 1966, Buxton filed a formal protest with the USPHS, arguing the study was unethical and should be stopped. The agency reviewed his complaint and rejected it. In 1968, he filed again. Rejected again. The official response was that the study was too close to completion to terminate. By 1972, Buxton had exhausted every internal channel. He did something that would end his career in government. He gave the documents to a journalist. Her name was Jean Heller, and she worked for the Associated Press. On July 25, 1972, Heller's story ran in newspapers across the country. The public reaction was immediate. Congressional hearings were called, led by Senator Edward Kennedy. By October, an advisory panel had declared the study ethically unjustified. In November 1972, it was officially terminated. At that point, 28 men had died directly from syphilis. Over 100 had died from complications. 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The study had run for 40 years. It ended not because the government stopped it. It ended because one man refused to stay quiet. In 1973, civil rights attorney Fred Gray filed a class action lawsuit against the U.S. government on behalf of the survivors. In 1974, a settlement was reached, $10 million to be divided among the living participants and the heirs of the dead. A survivor with syphilis received $37,500. The heir of someone who had died received less. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which required all federally funded research involving human subjects to undergo ethical review by institutional review boards, the IRBs that today govern every clinical trial in the country. The Belmont Report followed in 1979, establishing the three foundational principles of ethical research: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. On May 16, 1997, President Bill Clinton stood in the White House and addressed 8 of the study's surviving participants. "What the government did was shameful, and I am sorry," he said. "I apologize, and I am sorry that this apology has been so long in coming." The survivors were by then very old men. Most of those who had been deceived for decades were already dead. The apology came 25 years after the study ended, and 65 years after it began. But the damage did not end with the apology. A 2016 study published in the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy found that disclosure of the Tuskegee experiment measurably reduced life expectancy among Black Americans, specifically Black men over 45. The estimated gap in life expectancy between Black and white men in 1980 was partly explained by reduced healthcare engagement following the study's exposure. Trust, once broken at that scale, does not simply heal. The Tuskegee study is sometimes framed as a relic, something that happened in a different America, before ethics boards, before informed consent, before we knew better. That framing is convenient, and it is wrong. The study didn't happen because there were no rules. It continued for 25 years after penicillin, not out of ignorance, but out of institutional indifference to the lives. The rules were ignored because the people in charge decided those lives were worth less than the data. That is not an accident of history. It is a choice that was made, renewed, and defended every single year for 4 decades. Every IRB that reviews a clinical trial today exists because of what happened in Macon County, Alabama. Every informed consent form of patient signs exists in part because 399 men were never given the chance to say no. Their names were never famous. Most of them are buried in the same Alabama soil where they were deceived. But the system that protects every research participant in the world today was built, in part, on what was done to them. That is their legacy, and it deserves to be remembered exactly as it was.